Well, I mean, I think the first thing we have to understand about coronavirus is that it is the invisible enemy, as President Trump has referred to it as. It's very hard to think of yourself as being at war with the virus, but I think in this case, war analogies are actually appropriate. We have to defeat the enemy. We have to make sure that we defeat it quickly and soundly so that we can get back on with our lives, that we can live our lives. Even there's a way in which that enemy occupies territory that we have to make sure that we extinguish. And so we have to use all the resources at our disposal. I think it's a whole, what, the World Health Organization, which has had a mixed record on this epidemic, which we could talk about, as have many people have stumbled with this pandemic. But nonetheless, I think the wartime effort is the right way to think about it because it does involve a whole of society effort and it requires a whole of government effort. You saw President Trump on Friday, yesterday, announced that he would be using the Defense Production Act, which is what we used during World War II, to manufacture the tanks and the jets and all the artillery that we needed. So I think what you're going to see is some very interesting changes. In some ways, this is the beginning of the 21st century, even though it's 20 years into it. There's a way in which I think that the coronavirus pandemic marks a new beginning. I think we're going to see reshoring of the biomedical and manufacturing industries back to the United States. I expect other developed nations will do similarly. We cannot be dependent on China for 100% of our pharmaceutical production. We cannot be dependent on China for the production of personal protective equipment. We can't be dependent on foreign countries for the production of medical devices like ventilators. So I think that I don't think it will take a long time to win the war, but I think it's best to think of it that way. There has to be that amount of focus and aggression to killing the enemy. I think the good news is we can see an end at we can see a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. It looks as though the peak of the impact of the disease could come as early as mid-April. With a downturn in the summer and some need then in the fall to take on some more public health measures.
James.
So what do you make, Mike, of Donald Trump's thoughts that he could get the economy moving by Easter? Is that unrealistic? Personally, I think it probably is. But what do you think of the other idea, though, that you should be looking more to focus on vulnerable populations and then letting the economy start to slowly open itself up while keeping those who are the more vulnerable populations locked in some sort of places that they're not going to be vulnerable for? Can you walk us through your thoughts on this as a scientist?
Sure. Well, I mean, the first thing I wanted to say, just in regards to, I think all governments were reluctant to act swiftly and dramatically on this for really understandable reasons. And by the way, one of the countries that's looked to as having been very successful in squelching the pandemic before it could spread too quickly is South Korea. But it's also the case that the South Korean president was also reluctant to act. I think it's understandable that heads of state don't want to do things that would hurt their economy. And that's true whether you're a conservative leader or a progressive or liberal one. There's basically two visions that have been laid out by the leading scientific teams that work on this. One of them is Imperial College London, obviously based out of UK, and then the other is University of Washington here in the United States. In the Imperial College model, they imagine sort of 5 waves in which we would engage in social distancing like we're engaged in now. Each wave would probably be smaller than this one, and maybe more action towards the fall when we would expect to see coronavirus come back more strongly. The other model has been presented by University of Washington, and I interviewed the head of that team. It's a 500-person team. They're working on a $300 million grant from the Bill Gates Foundation. It's one of the biggest teams modeling the impacts of coronavirus on hospital capacity. And he told me that he saw the peak if we continue with these measures in mid-April, that we could lessen the measures significantly in May, and then even more significantly in the summer. And then he does not expect a second wave. And that is something that I think, it's not just that scientists disagree about it, it's just that we don't know. I mean, more people died in the second wave of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemics than did in the first wave, at least in the United States. But or I think globally, but I think in this case, we just don't know. So one question is whether we can basically engage in what you might call micro-suppressions, where we engage in more modest social isolation and stay-at-home orders throughout this year in the fall, so that mostly we can get back to work. And of course, going back to work and being able to isolate the people that are infected depends on much more testing. I mean, I think a growing number of us just think we need to have, and it looks like we're going to get two kinds of tests, one that detects whether we're infected with the virus, and then the second will detect whether we've had the virus. And those open up the possibility of opening up more workplaces, communities, potentially whole cities in ways which we haven't been able to do without that testing.
Rita.
I wanted to ask you about some of these figures. You mentioned in Imperial College and Professor Neil Ferguson, who leads that team, his estimates, which led to Britain's current policy of locking things down, have been revised dramatically. Initially, he was talking about 500,000 deaths. Now he's talking about less than 20,000 and saying most of those would have died anyway from other related conditions that they already suffer from.
Yeah, the model didn't actually change. I mean, obviously what changed was just the fact that we're all at home now. Not all of us, but a huge share of Americans and Australians and Europeans are at home practicing radical social distancing. So there's two models. And so the Imperial College one that you mentioned, which had a model that estimated 500,000 deaths in Britain, 2 million deaths in the United States if we did nothing. Now, of course, it's not safe to assume that we would do nothing. Of course, we're going to do something. Of course, we've taken very dramatic actions. So, and in fact, the University of Washington model and the Imperial College model basically have the same, have similar conclusions, even though they use different methods. The Imperial College method was just to see what would happen with the virus if you did nothing. And then the University of Washington one was to see what will be the impact of current actions on the trajectory of the virus. But both of them, I mean, look, there's just huge uncertainties. As President Trump has said repeatedly, we've never had this experience before. The lessons from 1918 are somewhat applicable, but we just don't know. I mean, I think that's why, again, the testing is really important. And I think, we don't talk about it enough. There's been some recognition of the ways in which we're all in this together. But I mean, if you just look at what's going on right now in Europe, the United States, Australia, it's pretty amazing how many of us are participating in this effort to save lives. And I think we should recognize that that's what we're doing and feel good about that. It's not like, there's a condemnation when people are behaving irresponsibly. This is the kind of moral behavior that I think we want to see, but obviously we want to get back to work too. So you've got to have some kind of a conversation in the society about how do we do this in ways where we can both win the war against coronavirus and also get back to living our lives and hopefully get the economy to come back before the end of the year.
Absolutely. Michael Shellenberger, so great always to get your common sense and your optimism, which is fantastic, and your scientific knowledge. People can follow you on Twitter at ShellenbergerMD, and anywhere else they can find you, Michael.
Yeah, Shellenberger MD on Twitter, and then also environmentalprogress.org is the website. Thanks for having me on.
Fantastic, Mike. Speak to you soon. Thank you so much.